Good evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel are Thomas Peele, investigative reporter with the Bay Area News Group; Felicity Barringer, environmental reporter with the New York Times; and Carla Marinucci, senior political writer with the San Francisco Chronicle. Carla Marinucci, the governor did a couple of dramatic things this week. What were they?
Well, first he signed a budget package, Belva, billions of dollars in very ugly cuts. Did it without Republicans helping him out there. And this has gone into the budget battle that we've been having for months since he came into office. This week, for the first time, he appealed directly to the people. He went onto YouTube and said, listen, we're checking in with you, but you need to know there are going to be some very, very drastic cuts ahead if we don't get a budget package signed. And we're talking about hours now before this has to be delivered, before he has to come up with some Republican support to put this on the ballot, maybe by Monday. And if not, then it's going to look very, very drastic in California, as he said. I mean, this whole thing this week has really sort of dramatized how this Sacramento is such a different Sacramento from where Jerry Brown held office more than 30 years ago. I mean, the collegiality is gone. The bipartisanship is over the top, with term limits and these super safe districts. Both sides feel, the Republicans in this case, feel that they don't have to contribute to that 2/3 majority. Even some very moderate Republicans and veteran legislators are saying, why?
Carla, you said something. I want to make sure you meant that. Bipartisanship is over the top. Did you really mean that?
I meant partisanship.
Okay.
The partisanship is over the top.
Right.
It is, people really can't believe how these discussions have come down. Brown has done it in a way. The YouTube discussion was interesting because he hasn't gone out. He's done a lot of this work behind the scenes, taking these Republicans to dinner, sitting down with them over a glass of wine, going to their caucus meetings, going to budget panels, having a civil discussion, not being incendiary, not going out and doing town hall meetings or calling them girly men like their own Republican governor did. The fact is, though, a lot of people are saying maybe he should have done the YouTube, the appeal to the voters directly a lot earlier, ramp up that pressure on the Republicans, because they are simply not delivering as it's coming down to the final days. They do not want tax extensions. And I was at the Republican convention last weekend. They're very, very hardened on this. And Darrell Steinberg, the head of the Democratic Senate, the Senate Majority Leader, said, look, the Republican Party in California at this point answers to a guy in Washington, Grover Norquist, a couple of radio shock jocks, and a blogger in Sacramento. And that's where we're down to, I think, a lot of the discussion. These people are so influential on the next election that Republican legislators are just afraid to move.
Carla, thank you. On the YouTube thing, he put that up at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. I mean, did he think he was on SNL? I mean, the first 36 hours it was online, he had less than 3,000 hits on it.
But we got to remember that Jerry Brown has been a governor who's been very, very savvy in use of social media. He's had about 40,000 hits by this time, but the fact is, it's probably 40,000 hits of Republicans looking at this thing and saying, what does he plan next?
Does he tweet?
He does tweet. He tweets. His dog tweets. His wife tweets. They're all over social media. They've used it very, very effectively. But, wow, even in this case, when you're talking about the California budget, the fact that all of this effort by Brown has not been able to move the Republicans off this no tax theme. When we talk about them answering to one guy in Washington, that would be Grover Norquist, who heads the Americans for Tax Reform. Most of the Republican legislators up there have signed a no tax pledge. So they are saying that even putting this on the ballot violates that pledge. They are many of the Republicans I talked to. Former Senator Jim Brulte, who was a leader up there, said, "Look, I think Governor Brown has done everything right in terms of trying to move people over onto this to at least get it in front of the voters, but." Legislators are just looking at the next election, really. That's what's going on.
So, Plan B?
Well, Plan B and Plan C, Brown said this week, everywhere he turns, there are bears in the woods here. It doesn't look like any good situation. But Plan B is, as Steinberg said today, look, maybe we're just going to pull the plug on all these talks and put this on the ballot without Republican support. Brown has said all along he wants to get them, but that may be the only other way, because if it doesn't happen Monday, it doesn't happen in June.
So let's establish what he's trying to do is to have voters decide whether they want to extend some taxes. But he signed these bills cutting lots today. What was
That's
the
right.
thing
So
that stands out?
now we're only halfway there. We have a $26 billion budget gap. The bills he signed cut about $12 billion. So now there's $14 billion, which he wants to close with these tax extensions. If these don't get on the ballot, he said all cuts budget. And you're talking about, and people have said, cutting the school year by 3 weeks, severely cutting fire, other emergency services. So California, he said, if Californians want to do that, he's going to do it. But whether they really want to do it, I think when it's all laid out and the kind of plan that's being talked about, it is very ugly.
Can I just ask? I'm sorry.
I was going to turn to you to ask you about the next big thing that happened coming out of Sacramento, and that was AB 32. Just last week, we had Mary Nichols, the head of the Air Resources Board here, talking about AB 32 and how she planned to move forward in implementing it. And yet this week, you covered a story where the court said they're going to do something that Prop 23 put on the ballot by the big oil companies couldn't do. Stop. AB 32.
Well, it's been stopped. I'm not sure for how long it's been stopped. I don't want to overstate it, but it was, to me, exceedingly ironic that you had the oil companies spending tens of millions of dollars trying to basically sidetrack AB 32 forever. Went down in flames, that proposition. The opponents were very successful, and now you have a judge in a lawsuit brought close to 3 years ago, at least 2.5 years ago, by some environmental justice groups who are coming at it from very much the left of center and saying you can't put this law into effect the way you want to at this point because cap and trade as a policy allows big industrial polluters to buy allowances and keep on polluting. And that's going to hurt our constituents. That disproportionately affects poor people, minority people who live in the neighborhoods around refineries, around power plants. And so that's I mean, it doesn't make a lot of chemical sense in this case because AB 32 is about cutting greenhouse gases, which at ground level don't do any harm to anyone. But the argument was, wait a minute, these greenhouse gases get capped and other dangerous gases that do harm locally, things like ozone, things like fine particulates, they may still fall out locally.
So Felicity, when we're talking about neighborhoods that are in some of these areas, West Oakland, Richmond, you're talking about.
Wilmington down
Yeah,
south.
I mean, are they in danger? Or do these environmental groups have sort of a case that these big companies get to throw things out into the air, buy these purchase these pollution allowances, and still harm the health of the people in the neighborhoods? Do they have a case there?
Well, all I can say is the judge, it was a two-part decision, and the judge rejected all the arguments that had to do with what the groups seemed to want. I don't want to say that they did want, but they were pointing towards direct regulation, which says you must, industrial facility, you must cap by this amount, and you can't buy it off with an allowance. The judge said no. The scoping plan, which is one of the documents that was crucial in the development of AB 32 on the ground, the scoping plan is fine. You don't need a lot more direct regulation. That's the double irony here, is all the arguments that were essentially environmental justice arguments about poor neighborhoods got turned back. The argument that the judge upheld was, which the groups had thrown in as their sort of second line of attack, was an economist's argument, which is, if you want to get rid of greenhouse gases, do you do cap and trade or do you go with a carbon tax? And he said the scoping plan, which I'll explain in a second, was one of a lot of different documents. He said the scoping plan didn't properly examine that. It kissed it off in a couple of sentences, and they need to go back to the drawing board for that.
So explain the scoping plan real quick.
The scoping plan.
That.
You've all seen, I'm sure, movies that have like 3 endings. You say, okay, I'm glad that's over, and then there's another ending, and then there's another. Well, AB 32 has had about 5 beginnings. There was the passage of the law in 2006 and the signing by Governor Schwarzenegger. At the time of the last few weeks of debate in 2006, the environmental justice groups were already making noises about this. That's one of the reasons that cap and trade was not mandated in the law itself, but was laid over to the regulators. So then it goes from the legislature and the governor to the regulators, and that's Mary Nichols' group, the California Air Resources Board, and they put out document after document. It was so process heavy, it wasn't so that it was hard to follow. It was that you seemed, why do you have to keep telling me about these steps? Right. But it was to make sure that everybody had a say in things. The scoping plan was essentially, imagine you have a road map that's the entire state of California with all the roads in it. And then imagine that an online mapping system gives you directions that say you could take Route 5, you could take 99, you could take, you could maybe take 101. The scoping plan essentially was that second map. It didn't say you must go this way, but it said these are the groups of things we're considering, and a carbon tax was not one of them.
I didn't interrupt you because the complicated subject, and I want to make sure that me and everybody else understood. But how long does this stop?
It stops until they get, the Air Resources Board goes back and essentially does an analysis and presents it as part of the scoping plan on cap and trade versus a carbon tax or fee, and perhaps some other alternatives, but that was the one the judge hit the hardest. So again, in 2008, you had the scoping plan. The world has moved on. In 2010, there was another decision narrowing the map still further. That has to stay on hold while they go back to 2008.
All right. AB 32. We also are beginning to see the outcome of a long-term investigation in the murder of journalist Chauncey Bailey. That trial got started, testimony this week. Thomas Peele, tell us what that was about.
Well, this finally begins more than 1,300 days after Chauncey Bailey was assassinated as he walked to work on August 2nd, 2007. And after a long jury selection process with almost 900 jurors coming in at the start to try to overcome defense issues on a change of venue, the jury's been seated, 5 alternates, 3.5 days of testimony now, and Chauncey's admitted killer, Devondre Broussard, took the stand yesterday morning and began to go through what is going to be days and days of really rather agonizing testimony as he attempts to articulate his story to this jury of 7 women and 5 men, excuse me.
Yeah, when you say his admitted killer, though, hasn't he recanted that confession?
Well, that's a great point, Belfa. He said he didn't do it. Then he gave a flawed confession, he claims, and says he did it alone. Then he says that was false and he didn't have anything to do with it at all. Then he agreed to cooperate and said that he was ordered to do it. And that's kind of where it stands now. He's testifying against his former spiritual leader, who he says ordered Mr. Bailey and 2 other men killed in 2007.
And Tom Broussard is the centerpiece of this whole case. As you mentioned, his testimony's gone back and forth. There's been questions about how the Oakland police, Oakland DA has handled this case. Isn't this a big risk? How much is it all hanging on him and his testimony?
His testimony is coming early in what's going to be a trial that they say is 3 months, but probably could be longer. He's on the stand pretty early in this, and he has changed his story, and he is not the best witness in terms of his ability to articulate himself. He answered questions of the prosecutor on direct examination yesterday by saying, I don't know the words to answer your question. Anything beyond a yes or a no answer, this young man really stumbled. And the defense lawyers have said their entire case really comes down to his credibility and attacking his credibility. His cross is going to be brutal. Having said that, there's a lot of other evidence that's going to follow him in this case. There are other hurdles for the defense to overcome. There are issues of telephone records, automobile tracking devices.
Tapes, are there not?
Tapes, there are recordings. There's a videotape. There's a tape where Yusuf Bey IV and the statement he gave to prosecutors.
Let's be clear on
Sure.
Yusuf Bey and his role, and is
Yes.
he on trial or is Broussard on trial?
No, he's on trial. Yusuf Bey IV is charged with ordering 3 murders. His co-defendant Antoine Mackey is charged with helping Broussard carry out 2 of them and commit 1 himself. And Broussard has turned state's evidence and has a 25-year deal pending on the veracity of his testimony.
Have there been emotional moments in the trial so far?
You know, there were. They showed, for instance, autopsy photo of Mr. Bailey yesterday morning, and blunt testimony from the medical examiner about a point-blank shotgun wound to his head. And there was this visceral response from jurors. They cringed. They looked away. There was one man who you could just see tighten up almost muscularly and like clench his fist and look at the floor and shake his head.
And this is an important case. We should remember, Chauncey Bailey,
Right.
how many American journalists have been killed in
Right.
this country on the job, really?
Right. This is the first murder of a journalist on a domestic issue working on a local story in the United States since 1976. That's really what is the interest in this case. He was writing a story. I got to see that story months after it didn't run in the Oakland Post. It was reporting on a public bankruptcy filing. It wasn't anything that was not already really on the public record. And the fact that this young man who was alleged to have ordered the murder had no proportionality as to what the impact on that story was going to be, or on what that impact of that story on him was going to be.
So what we are in is the murder trial that was based upon the Your Black Muslim Bakery
Yes.
and its doings and its influence in Oakland.
Yes.
All right, so we'll be checking in, obviously, over a number of weeks with you,
Great.
Tom. So
Thank you.
My thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight.